I am a historian, or more accurately, an obsessive explorer of Cold War relics. There is something about these forgotten places that pulls me in, especially those military installations that were never meant to exist. They are like abandoned monsters, slumbering in the cracks of time, waiting for someone to awaken them. This discovery began with an outdated military map, one that was never supposed to exist. It came from an amateur collector who claimed that one of the marked locations had never appeared in any official records. Deep in the forests along the German border lay a Cold War bunker that had been completely erased. No records. No public information. Everything pointed to the same question: why was it erased? With that mystery in mind, I packed my gear and set out alone to the coordinates on the map. The forest was colder than I expected. The branches twisted and tangled, skeletal remnants of something long dead. The sun was smothered by thick clouds, and the entire area was cloaked in a damp, suffocating silence. Each step I took was met with the brittle snap of fallen branches. I could hear my own heartbeat, slow, heavy, like the distant pounding of a drum. And then, at last, beyond a moss-covered concrete wall, I found it. The hidden bunker. A heavy iron door stood slightly ajar. Faint traces of an old military designation were still visible on the rusted frame, though much of it had been corroded away. But one phrase remained clear. Gate of Paradise. A grim name. Was it truly a paradise, or the entrance to something far worse? I hesitated. But curiosity always wins over caution. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open. The scent of rust filled the air, thick and metallic, like the stagnant breath of something long dead. Inside, the darkness was suffocating. Only a faint sliver of light seeped through a crack at the end of the corridor, barely illuminating the dust-coated floor. I switched on my flashlight. As the beam cut through the blackness, something emerged on the walls. Graffiti. Don't open it. The words, scrawled in red German script, looked less like a warning and more like a desperate plea. The handwriting was uneven, trembling, as if the person who wrote it had been overcome with terror. Then, "It's always listening." Another warning, smeared onto the opposite wall. The letters were jagged, some of them scratched so deeply into the concrete that they had gouged the surface. Someone had carved these words in panic, fingernails, or perhaps even a knife. My throat tightened. The beam of my flashlight wavered slightly. The warnings weren't the only thing wrong here. There were footprints. Not mine. They pressed deep into the thick layer of dust, leading further into the bunker. And there were no prints leading back. Whoever had entered had never left. I licked my dry lips and forced myself to stay calm. Maybe the footprints belonged to an old explorer. Maybe the warnings were just the remnants of a soldier's dark sense of humor. But the fear in my gut was spreading, clinging to me like damp mold. The air was thick with the scent of rusted metal and something else, something faintly rotten, like the staleness of a place long sealed off from the world. I stepped forward carefully, every movement feeling like a step closer to the edge of an unseen abyss. At the end of the hallway stood a door. One that had never been opened. A thick military seal was still plastered across its surface, though time had worn its letters down. Yet I could still make out one phrase. Projekt Morpheus. The lettering on the seal made my pulse quicken. Projekt Morpheus. I had seen this name before, buried in declassified Cold War archives. During the Cold War, the East and West weren't just competing in nuclear arms and espionage. There were other, more unorthodox battles being fought deep within the realm of psychological warfare. Rumors spoke of experiments designed to weaponize dreams, to manipulate human consciousness, and even to torture enemies to death within their own nightmares. But all such research had supposedly been erased, buried by governments desperate to wash their hands of the past. So why were there still traces of it here? With that question gnawing at me, I began searching the bunker for any surviving documents. It wasn't long before I found something. Inside the control room, tucked away in a rusted filing cabinet, lay a stack of yellow papers. The cover bore the same insignia: Projekt Morpheus. I turned to the first page. The words sent a chill down my spine. Emergency protocol: the room has been sealed. The experiment is terminated. Terminated. But if the experiment was over, why did it need to be sealed? I flipped through the pages, my breath quickening. Then I found it. The final report. Subjects unable to wake. They remain trapped within the dream state, unable to establish contact with reality. We cannot determine whether they still exist in this world, or if they have become something else. The last entry was scrawled hastily, the handwriting jagged, erratic, as if written in sheer panic. It's still alive. A sound cut through the silence. A faint, scraping noise, like fingernails dragging against concrete. I whipped around, my heart slamming against my ribs. The sound was coming from behind the sealed iron door. Something was moving inside. I held my breath, staring at the door. It didn't move, but the air had changed. A faint whisper curled through the room, distant yet unmistakable, like voices murmuring just beyond the veil of reality. My grip tightened around the flashlight. My fingers had gone numb. Was something still in there? A shiver crawled down my spine. Then, a sudden, chilling realization settled in my gut. If I opened that door, if I crossed that threshold, my world would never be the same again. But the worst part wasn't the fear. It was my own hand, moving, reaching. Something on the other side was calling to me. The seal on the door was brittle, worn down by time, barely clinging to the rusted metal. My fingers hovered over the iron lock, trembling slightly. In my mind, two voices battled. One screamed at me to stop, the other whispered, urging me forward. The scraping on the walls had ceased, but the feeling remained. That presence. Watching. Waiting. I took a deep breath and turned the lock. A dull click echoed through the bunker. The door loosened. Slowly, I pushed it open. Darkness surged outward like a tide, carrying with it a wave of rot, damp, putrid, thick with decay. Like something had been trapped inside, rotting for decades. My flashlight sliced through the blackness, illuminating the room beyond. The walls were smeared with an oily black substance, as though something had seeped from within. Pinned to them were dozens of crude sketches, faces, twisted, malformed, mouths stretched wide, gaping impossibly, frozen in silent screams. Their eyes, hollow, scooped out. The edges of the paper were torn, shredded by ragged fingernails, as if someone had clawed at them in desperation. In the center of the room stood a rusted metal chair. Straps dangled from the armrests, leather restraints still fastened, as if waiting for the next occupant. The floor beneath it bore deep scratches, marks of something, someone who had fought to be free. But my eyes weren't drawn to the chair. They were pulled toward the corner. Toward it. A figure stood in the shadows, barely human. Its limbs were too long, too thin, its skin cracked and warped, wrinkled like old burned scars. And its face. It had none. Where a face should have been, there was only void, a writhing, shapeless blackness, as if reality itself had been erased from that spot. My flashlight beam wavered unnaturally, the light bending, warping around it, as if space itself distorted in its presence. It didn't move, but I knew it was looking at me. Then, the whispers began. No longer distant. No longer outside of me. They were inside my head. You are part of the experiment now. You will never wake up. The nightmare has begun. Images flooded my mind, visions of those who had come before me. The test subjects. Trapped. Screaming. Their bodies contorted in their restraints, their faces dissolving into something inhuman. their despair, their deaths. My breath came in ragged gasps. My heart pounded, frantic, erratic, like it was trying to escape my ribcage. I tried to run. I couldn't. Something held me in place, an unseen force anchoring me to the floor. And then, it moved. Even though it didn't. The air turned frigid. My vision blurred. My thoughts were slipping. It was pulling me in, swallowing me whole. No, I have to leave. I bit my tongue hard, the pain snapping me back to reality for a moment. With all the strength I could muster, I twisted my body, tearing myself free from the invisible grip, and bolted out of the room. The darkness behind me seemed alive, rushing toward me. I could feel it closing in, even though I couldn't hear any footsteps. But I knew it was following. I ran through the bunker's corridors, the whispers echoing louder in my ears. They were sharper now, a cacophony of voices, as though 100 different beings were speaking all at once. The lights flickered, casting everything into chaotic shadows. The graffiti on the walls was changing, those twisted faces were becoming more animated, their mouths curling into grotesque smiles. "Don't open it." The words on the walls were moving, writhing like living things crawling across the surface. I pushed myself harder, my chest threatening to burst from the strain, my footsteps unsteady. Finally, I burst through the iron door. The cold air hit me like a slap. I stumbled and fell onto the damp earth, gasping for breath, my body soaked in sweat that clung to my clothes like ice. Did I make it out? I looked up at the sky. My heart stopped. It was blood red. The clouds twisted and churned like some enormous, writhing creature. The trees of the forest stood still, unnaturally still, as if frozen by some unseen force. The air was thick with a suffocating silence, a deadness that seemed to consume everything. The world felt like it had stopped moving. And farther in the distance, the town. It was nothing but ruins. This was not my world anymore. I stood, slowly backing away. The bunker's doors remained wide open, a gaping maw, waiting for the next prey. I wanted to turn and run, but I felt something beneath my feet. I looked down. A metal plate was protruding from the dirt. The letters on it froze me in place. D of Paradise. It had returned to where it all began. Slowly, I lifted my gaze. The bunker's walls loomed before me. The faint, blurry warning on them. It was now coming into focus. Don't open it. But this time, the handwriting was different, freshly scrawled, as if just written. My hand still gripped the dusty red marker. A cold dread seized me, like ice flooding my veins. I had written those warnings. Or more accurately, I was trapped here. The dark bunker still loomed behind me, its entrance gaping wide, and my whisper, my own voice, was quietly reverberating on the walls. Do not open.